Okay, welcome everyone. We will start promptly at 1 p.m. GMT, although some people are still filtering in. But we'll just start out with some housekeeping. My name is Lindsay Arthur, and I'm from the Icelandic Ministry of Education, Science, and Culture. And I'm part of the Arctic Science Ministerial Organizing Committee. I'm going to start out this webinar today with an Arctic lands acknowledgement. So this is adapted from the IASC State of the Arctic report for use in our webinar today. The circumpolar Arctic is the contemporary home to many different Indigenous peoples. Wherever you may be participating in this webinar, we honor and recognize the place-based knowledge of Arctic Indigenous peoples and their ancestral and contemporary stewardship of their homelands, and we welcome you to do the same. So to get started with just some housekeeping, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to the European Polar Board YouTube page and shared on the ASM3 website. For all attendees, your microphones and cameras are automatically turned off, so you don't have to worry about that. If you're having any trouble, you can use the chat box and ask for assistance, or you can also see the Zoom website support page, and we'll share a link for that in the chat box. The full program for today is available on the ASM3 website. We'll also share a link to that in the chat box for you. As we go, we will have 5 panelists speaking today, and if you have any questions for them, you can direct them to the Q&A box. So please use that specific Q&A box, not just the general chat box. We'll address what questions we have when we can in the Q&A at the end, but also, if you have questions just as we go, you can put them in the box and maybe the panelists can answer them directly before we go to the Q&A. We do just have 1 hour today, so we don't know how much time we'll have for the Q&A at the end. For this webinar, IASC has agreed to let us use their code of conduct, which they developed for ASSW 2020. So the link to this will be posted in the chat. What's most important to remember, though, is that we create a respectful atmosphere. We listen and ask questions with an open mind. So please know that abuse or harassment of any kind will not be tolerated. So before we get started, if you can just go to the next slide, we want to give sort of an overview of the Arctic research information that has happened in this ASM3 science process. So we've solicited updates on Arctic science and research from many different channels. The countries, Indigenous peoples organizations, international organizations, which include the working groups of the Arctic Council, have submitted project updates, new projects, and as well, they filled out a survey on international cooperation through the ASM3 science process. So additionally, we've also solicited feedback through online surveys and research community workshops. And then our Science Advisory Board has reviewed all of the science submitted through this process, and then it's through this webinar series that we are beginning to share some of that information with all of you. So next slide. On the horizon, as the ministerial draws closer, we are now starting to wrap up the final products of this ASM, which is a result of the science process. So countries are collaborating right now on the joint statement of ministers with input from Indigenous peoples organizations. The final report is being developed, and we are also planning to share more online resources, including recordings from this webinar series, which can already be found on the ASM3 website, a research page on international research opportunities, the Arctic research overview submitted by ASM3 participants, as well as a beta project of the project database. So the 3rd Arctic Science Ministerial will be held in Tokyo in May of this year. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our moderator for today, Mia Bennett. Mia is an assistant professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Hong Kong, and she is a member of our ASM3 Science Advisory Board. So Mia is going to provide an overview of Theme 2 before giving the floor to our panelists. So Mia, you can take it away.
Great, thanks so much, Lindsay, and thank you for the opportunity to share the update for Theme 2. Let me just make this larger here. So can everyone see this all right? Terrific. Okay, so Theme 2 is about understanding and predicting capabilities regarding Arctic environmental and social systems and their global impacts. And so our task here was to assess the progress that's been made across Arctic science in moving towards greater understanding of these issues. So in trying to analyze all of the projects that were submitted, we identified close to 200 projects that fit into this theme of understand. Some of them had overlaps with some of our other themes, such as observe, but the projects that I'll be describing and focusing on, which we'll also see highlights of after this brief presentation, I'll touch upon trying to enhance our understanding effectively. And so I'm going to first synthesize a couple of main takeaways that the Science Advisory Board kind of concluded were some important advances that have been made with regard to understanding the Arctic. And the first would be that there's been important progress made in understanding Arctic ecosystems. And a lot of that work is increasingly focused on the intersection of different ecosystems, which happen to be some of the Arctic's most productive and biodiverse areas. Two key examples where we noticed significant advances being made were at the land-sea interface, so where Arctic coasts comes up against littoral seas, for instance, and the Arctic Ocean. And equally, there's been a lot of work done at the sea-ice interface, which is a really exciting and interesting ecosystem as well, and one that's recently been in the news. You might have seen the other day with work from the opposite side of the planet in Antarctica, where scientists had discovered an untold number of creatures on the bottom of an iceberg thousands of feet below the surface. So really exciting advances can be made at these interfaces, we have noticed. A second area of progress is that a number of projects are looking into ecosystems that are either disappearing or emerging. So we all know that the Arctic is one of the fastest changing regions on Earth. And with that, on the one hand, we have projects such as one out of Canada that was focused on the last ice area. And this is particularly focused on places where thick multi-year sea ice is fast disappearing. And so that area is concentrated largely in the Canadian Arctic archipelago, in the north of the archipelago, close to northwest Greenland. And so looking at the kind of phenomena that are happening there as ice gets ever thinner is one area that advances are being made in. In tandem with focus into disappearing ecosystems, we also have a number of projects that are looking at emerging ecosystems, largely coming about as a result of climate change. And perhaps the area of key focus here is the Central Arctic Ocean. One area of focus within that region that is becoming more and more accessible as sea ice thins and shrinks concerns fisheries. So there, you might be familiar, of course, with the recent moratorium that was signed on commercial fishing in the Central Arctic Ocean, which is predicated on the idea that more scientific research needs to be done before we can go into this area and begin carrying out commercial fishing. And so some of that work has been carried out by NOAA, but also in partnership with a number of other researchers from around the world. So both advances in terms of understanding disappearing ecosystems and emerging ecosystems. In concert with work on emerging ecosystems, there's been a lot of work into societal, commercial, and geopolitical impacts of these opening areas. And I think this reflects, we noticed, the growing importance of research into coupled human environment systems. We see this across scientific research worldwide with increasing recognition of the Anthropocene, the era in which humans are having a larger impact than perhaps any other force on the planet. And so I think with this type of work, scientists are acknowledging that nature is not just something existing separately from humans, but rather that we impact the environment and it impacts society in return. So a lot of the work in the Arctic is particularly attached to this type of framework. A third overarching theme that we could identify in the research under this umbrella of understand is that there's been a lot of advances made in understanding the atmospheric circulation of pollutants and climate forcers, such as black carbon and carbon dioxide. One example of a project to highlight here would be out of Japan, which has this major initiative called the Arctic Challenge for Sustainability. And one of those projects is looking at various greenhouse gases. And to do so, instruments have been put on commercial airliners, on ships, on land, and in various places. So this also shows the really creative and resourceful ways in which scientists are trying to gather more and more information in order to understand all of the changes going on in the Arctic across different ecosystems. So those are some of the main overarching areas of advances with regard to understanding the Arctic, but we also subset it into 7 different categories of work under this theme of understand. So the 7 categories, which of course are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but kind of areas in which we could group projects, would be climate, marine issues, ice, and permafrost, and then also ecosystems, as I noted, humans, and also pollution. Ecosystems was one particular area of research advances across a couple of different key areas under that. Marine ecosystems, also work on wildlife, on terrestrial ecosystems, which is one area of particular research growth, and also trying to understand how human and ecosystem health are interrelated. And then under marine ecosystems, we also noticed a couple of projects are focused on marine pollution, which is probably an area of increasing research as more and more commercial activity takes place in the Arctic Ocean. So just a few highlights to pull out, since I'm not able to overview everything, but just a couple of areas that we thought were important. First of all, in terms of looking at ecosystems, more understanding has been fostered with regard to looking at tundra, boreal forests, and also coastlines. With regard to terrestrial ecosystems, I think while of course there's a noted emphasis on the maritime domain, looking at terrestrial ecosystems that might have been somewhat understudied before, namely peatlands, swamps, and soil, kind of these more marginal ecosystems, but yet places that are major carbon sinks, is an area where we're seeing a lot of exciting research being done. Also, in terms of looking at how lichens could be a vector for bacteria, work in both of these areas, peatlands and swamps and soil and lichens, all of this kind of terrestrial work, a lot of that is coming out of Russia, which is perhaps unsurprising given that Russia comprises about half of the Arctic. So there's been a lot of work in this area, and probably with regard to health, we would anticipate that more work will be done in this area in view of course, greater concern over such issues following the pandemic. Another project I might highlight in terms of marine pollution is that I think Arctic scientists are thinking about pollution in novel ways, not just involving atmospheric forcers, but also light pollution, for instance, and looking at how species in the Arctic Ocean have been affected by light pollution during the polar night, effectively using this kind of, the Arctic as an experimental laboratory in a way, taking advantage of those unique conditions of extreme day and extreme night. And I think this type of research shows how the Arctic can inform broader understandings of natural phenomena elsewhere. So taking lessons out from the Arctic to inform understanding instead of just going vice versa is one exciting area where Arctic understanding can contribute to broader understanding. Looking at pollution, I mentioned how atmospheric forcers, black carbon and CO2, and also methane are areas of particular interest. And then moving to the marine environment and how we've advanced understanding there. Obviously, a lot of media coverage probably focuses on how scientists are trying to predict climate change, but a lot of that is based on our increasing knowledge, which has happened in recent years, of the paleo environment. So trying to reconstruct past climates from, for instance, sediment cores taken from the seabed. Also, advances have been made in oceanography, geochemistry, and bathymetry. A lot of this work is done very internationally, very collaboratively. For instance, I think the Mosaic cruise launched by Germany, but involving dozens of different countries and institutes, is a real example of this kind of collaborative work that is helping us to advance large-scale understanding of the Arctic. In terms of sea ice projects, this has been interesting because half of them have been led by Asian countries. And this is perhaps reflects the fact that Asian countries have maybe easier access to sea ice thanks to their icebreakers, and also the fact that ice is not always on land. So it's maybe just a bit more of an accessible topic for quote unquote non-Arctic countries. Tying these together, we've had increasing work on trying to improve predictions of future change, both environmentally and socially, looking at sea level rise, at near-term regional and global climate. And also, there's been a lot of cross-cutting work on linkages, as I mentioned, for instance, between coupled human and environment systems. So this is kind of how we segmented all of the research. I'm just going to quickly highlight a couple of other areas in terms of climate, ecosystems, and humans before I turn the floor over to the more specific presentations. So looking at climate, a lot of exciting work has been done at a higher scale, trying to integrate understanding of different parts of the climate. So one project I'll just highlight here is called the Changing Arctic Ocean, which is a promising example of how the UK and Germany have collaborated to understand how atmospheric and oceanic circulation changes are affecting the large-scale ecosystem structure and biogeochemical functioning of the Arctic Ocean. So again, this kind of interface between different ecosystems and different processes. Second, as I mentioned, a lot of this climate research is directly integrating societal concerns. We'll hear momentarily from Professor Bruce Forbes, who is helping to lead up the Charter program, which is a Finnish-led effort with lots of different international partners looking at how climate and biodiversity change will impact Arctic communities and their adaptive capacity. A lot of work, of course, as I noted, has been done of ecosystems. And I think one thing to highlight is that scientists are not just focusing on these kind of iconic species such as polar bears and walruses, but also looking at fisheries and then maybe the slightly more mundane but no less important creatures that form a critical part of the Arctic ecosystem, such as crustaceans, snow crabs, and even insects. So one project out of Norway, the EISA project, is looking at snow crabs in that instance. A lot of this work is also increasingly adopting the social ecological systems framework. The RAIN project out of Norway looking at reindeer is one example of that. And so overall, in terms of understanding ecosystems, collaboration between countries has been increasing, but we'd like to point out that still more could be done to truly integrate Indigenous knowledge and also leverage citizen science, especially at a time when scientists have decreasing access to the Arctic in view of the pandemic, and there are more and more opportunities to work with the residents who still live there. One gap to point out that we noticed was one project on reindeer herding did not actively mention Indigenous knowledge or partnership in the summary, and so this represents a clear opportunity among many to further integrate Indigenous knowledge into the work that scientists do. The last section here to highlight is in terms of work into humans and societies in the Arctic. There's been a lot of exciting advances in understanding how we can foster gender equality and diversity, largely coming out of Norway and Iceland. And one project to highlight here would be the recently funded Arctic Voices initiative in art and literature in the long 19th century, which here is presented a snapshot from the website. And this project is really seeking to retell the history of 19th century Arctic exploration and shift away from this white male hero explorer lens and retell those stories involving Indigenous peoples and wildlife and their voices. So making it a much richer picture. And I think we can see then how integrating humans into Arctic research can be done in the humanities as well in tandem with scientific research. So lastly here, who is doing all of this research? Of course, we have really exciting international collaboration that's continuing to bring in new partners into the Arctic, such as Thailand, you'll hear from a researcher shortly, Singapore, so Asian countries, and also other European countries, South American. The list continues to widen, which is really exciting for promising to push forward new understandings of the Arctic. We also see women and Indigenous peoples and early career researchers are becoming increasingly integral to Arctic research, not only in carrying out that research, but equally in designing it. So I think this is a really crucial part to make Arctic research and our understanding of it relevant to communities in a very inclusive and diverse sense. So I'm going to wrap things up there. And I'd now like to begin turning things over to our 5 presenters today. The first will be Gaël Durand from CNRS IGE, the project lead of the PROTECT project, projecting sea level rise from ice sheets to local implications.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the introduction and giving me the opportunity to give a brief overview of our project. So my name is Gaël Durand. I'm a research scientist at CNRS IGE in France and the scientific coordinator of the 2020 project PROTECT. The full name, which I think is rather self-explanatory, being projecting sea level rise from ice sheets to local implications. So next slide, please. So in a few minutes, some details about PROTECT. It started last September, and our aim is to produce robust, with quantified uncertainties projection of sea level rise due to the melting of land ice. So in short, we want to anticipate the mass loss of some 200,000 glaciers around the world, the mass loss of the Greenland and the Antarctic ice sheets as well. So altogether, this represents about 65-meter equivalent of sea level rise resting over the continents. Of course, most of this ice will not be suddenly dropped into the ocean in the next decade, centuries, or even millennia, but a significant part of it might. And our objective is to evaluate this contribution to produce global, but also regional and local projection of sea level rise for the coming decades at the 2100 time horizon and over the coming centuries up to 2500 at least. So some words about the project itself. 26 institutions are involved, grouping some 150 scientists coming from 8 countries, 6 in Europe, together with Greenland and Maldives. And of course, we are collaborating with many colleagues all around the world. Project is organized in 6 scientific work packages, together with work package 1 dealing with the project management and work package 8 for the coordination of the communication of the project and dissemination and exploitation of its results. I think the structure of the project presented on the right is of interest for you. Let me briefly explain why. Projection will only be pertinent if they are useful for the users and the stakeholders, and this is the objective of work package 2, as we want to co-design and co-produce our projections and related climate services. In the meantime, we need to improve our understanding of some processes, particularly the ones related to the potential drivers of a collapse of some regions, in Antarctica in particular, and this is the objective of work package 3. Then each specific land cryosphere component has its own work package. Antarctica in work package 4, the most uncertain contributor and where our efforts are the most significant. Greenland, which will be a major contributor during the coming century, and centuries actually, and alpine glacier that will most probably shrink very significantly sorry, in the next 100 years. Finally, using the inputs from the previous work packages, work package 7 will compute global and regional sea level changes and their implications. It is not signified in this sketch, but of course, co-designing is an iterative process, and this is why we will pass through all these work packages 2 times. At the beginning of the project, what we have called the fast track, to build the whole methodology and produce first projections. And this should be completed in about a year, and a meeting will be organized this fall to continue improving our interaction with stakeholders. Then the full track will follow to refine our results, and in particular, better take into account the progresses on our understanding of critical ice sheets processes. So to conclude, do not hesitate to have a look on our website for more information, or following us on Twitter. And within 2 weeks, you should be advertised on some very nice first results to be published in Nature. So thank you for your attention.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Gaël. That was fascinating. Next, I'll turn things over to Professor Brynhildur Davíðsdóttir from University of Iceland, who will be presenting ArcPath, Arctic Climate Predictions, Pathways to Resilient Sustainable Societies.
Thank you so much. So ArcPath is a 5-year international and an interdisciplinary research project, and it is funded by Nordforsk as a Nordforsk Center of Excellence in Arctic Research. And one of the institutional partners, out of the 11 institutional partners, I should say, is University of Iceland, and I am the team leader for the University of Iceland team. Next slide, please. So the target regions for our project are the northern coasts of Iceland, next to Húsavík, as you can see on the map, in northern Norway, in particular close to Tromsø and Skervøy, and then east and western Greenland, focusing on the areas around Ítökutormit and Lulissat. Next slide, please. So the project itself has 3 overarching objectives, and those are improved climate predictions, and then an increased understanding of how climate change interacts with multiple ecological and societal factors. And then what we do is that we combine the improved regional climate predictions with enhanced understanding of environmental, societal, and economic interactions. So basically what we're doing is to address the complex relationship between climate and socioeconomic change taking place in the Arctic. And we're asking the question, what do these physical changes in climate, sea ice, and the oceans actually mean to how people live in the area? And then, of course, with the overall goal of fostering responsible and sustainable development. Next slide, please. In our work on improved climate predictions, we are applying historical climatology as well as global climatological modeling and dynamic downscaling, and then down to our study regions. Next slide, please. Then when analyzing how climate change interacts with multiple ecological and social factors, we then consider several interrelated topics. So here, for example, we're looking at changes in the marine biological environment as a result of climate change. And then we reveal what socioeconomic implications that may have. What is interesting here is that the prism we apply in this context are cetaceans, with a particular focus on whales. So what we do is that we examine first what impact changes in climate and the ocean have had for whale populations. Then we establish the societal benefits derived from whales, and then based on that, examine how climate change may affect the possibility to sustain those benefits. And then finally, we focus on the synergies between climate change and marine management systems, and we evaluate their impact on the resiliency of coastal communities. Next slide, please. And just to give you a sort of a little insight into what I mean by benefits or importance of whales, we define that based on the benefits human societies derive from the natural environment, that is here from whales. And we call this collectively, or this is collectively called ecosystem services. And as you can see on the slide, these services can be of a very diverse form, ranging from provisional services such as food products, over to regulation and maintenance services such as nutrient cycling, and cultural services such as music and arts, cultural identity, and recreation. And we reveal these services and then their importance through interviews, socioeconomic and sociocultural surveys in all our study locations in Iceland, Norway, and in Greenland. Next slide, please. And just to give you a brief taste of what we're seeing in our results, we are seeing that marine species such as blue whales are migrating northwards, possibly due to climate change. And what we're also seeing is that whales are shown to be socially important in all our study locations, and they have diverse societal benefits, with actually cultural benefits, including cultural and community identity, existence value, in addition to recreation being considered the most important ones. We're also seeing that governance of whale ecosystem services in our regions is largely through informal institutions and self-governance, which then may be susceptible to external pressures derived from climate change. And then finally, the combined impact of ITQ systems in fisheries and climate change is increasing the stress to coastal communities. Next slide, please. To conclude, so ArcPath, the results we're deriving from ArcPath are illustrating that the understanding of the very diverse benefits local communities derive from the marine environment, such as whales in our case, and revealing the impact climate change and economic development may have on the ability to sustain those benefits, provide important insights to the resilience of coastal communities, to the direct and indirect pressures derived from climate change. And then in turn, these insights are very important when designing pathways to action towards more resilient and sustainable societies. Thank you.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Brynhildur. It was really fascinating to hear about all this work, and I hadn't really thought of whale ecosystem services. Really insightful. Thank you. Next, we'll be hearing from Suchana Appal Chavanich from Chulalongkorn University in Thailand, and she'll be discussing the linkages between Arctic climate change and marine debris.
Okay, thank you. Well, why Thailand as a non-Arctic country is interested in doing a research in Arctic area? Next slide. Actually, Thailand is interested in doing a research in Antarctic first because of Her Royal Highness Princess Mahachakri Sirinthorn graciously visited Antarctic in 1993, and later she realized that joining the Antarctic research with other countries will not only strengthen the research abilities for Thailand, but also will give an opportunity for Thai scientists to contribute their knowledge to the world science societies. Thailand is aware that doing a research in Antarctic is not easy because Thailand do not have a lot of budget, no station, no icebreaker, and Thailand is not in an Antarctic treaties. Thus, the collaboration with others is one of the important things. Next slide. So start from 2004 with the collaboration with Japan and later with China. Thailand have managed to send Thai scientists to join with their Antarctic expeditions, 1 or 2 researchers per year, depending on the circumstance. So later again, Her Royal Highness initiation, Thailand would like to expand a research to Arctic. Next slide. Thailand has first officially collaborated with Norway in Arctic research in 2015 with an MOU between University Center in Svalbard at and Chulalongkorn University with the princess preside over. Next, please. In addition, Thailand also has MOU with Chinese Institute for a joint research in both Arctic and Antarctic. Next slide, please. Yes, originally when Thailand started interested, we mainly focused on research, but later, as we know, Arctic has suffered from pollution created by human activity that not just from Arctic area, but also from outside of the Arctic area. And not many people, particular people who live in a tropic area like Thailand, would know that their activities such as releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and dumping trash into the ocean, those pollution can end up into the polar regions. So now our purpose is not just only doing a research in Arctic, but we also want to raise awareness on the importance of the polar region and how human activities around the world, including the tropical, can link to the change of the ocean in Arctic. This is a short video, one minute video showing what we did and what we found in our last trip to Arctic. So please, video. can see in the video, oceans in Arctic had changed. More algae, more jellyfish, more trash end up into the northernmost island in Svalbard. And we found quite a number of microplastic contaminated in the Arctic environment. Next slide. It is time to send those messages out to people who live outside the Arctic to let them know that their activity can have tremendous effect to the Arctic area. And we all need to care no matter where we live, because the Earth is in our hand. And Thailand would like to be a small messenger to show what really happened in Arctic and how non-Arctic countries can help to solve this problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Apple. That was fascinating and really exciting to see how collaboration with an Arctic country and a non-Arctic country can lead to all sorts of new research advances. So thank you. Next, we'll be hearing from Professor Dr. Hugues Lanthuis from the Alfred Wegener Institute Helmholtz Center for Polar and Marine Research. He is the project lead of Nunatsiaq, the co-designed adaptation and mitigation strategies for thawing permafrost and coastal erosion in northern Canada. Hugues.
Thank you, Mia. And actually, we're not only in northern Canada, we're covering the entire Arctic. And Nunatsiaq is a project that started in 2017 and it's running for 6 years. But more than a project, it's actually a fantastic group of people. I really want to thank all the participants in this project that make it possible. And it's incredible to be at the head of this project. And I'm very excited to report about it. We have 17 countries in the project, about 26 partners involved in this project, northern residents, engineers, social scientists, physical scientists, modelers. So it's a very, very transdisciplinary project. That's why the 6 years are essential if you want these people to actually get to talk to each other in a room. And that's why we put it forward when we submitted the project. Next slide. Next slide. That was the title slide. So what we're really focusing in this project on is the coast in the Arctic. And Mia, you showed it, that is a very important and very alarming process right now that is going on at this coast. You see from this slide here the rate of erosion of the coast of the Yukon. This is a place that is called Stokes Point, and here the rate has more than quadrupled. It's incredible, the increase in the rate of erosion that we see there. This has implications for infrastructure, for the coastal ecosystem, for harvesting, for subsistence living, many implications that we try to look at. Next slide. And the way we are trying to do that is first, obviously, to talk to people on site to understand what can we do and how should we do that, and then engage in a partnership to actually distribute the number of things that we want to do and understand who is going to do what, whether it's the scientists or the people on site collaboratively. There are many things that are going on, and then ultimately to get back to people on site to develop some possible adaptation and mitigation strategies. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples. Next slide. Consultations were manifold. We had many, and these are pictures mostly from the Western Canadian Arctic, as well as this little post on Facebook from Svalbard. But really what I want to say here is that this is only one side of the medal. Consultations are going on all the time, and I'm on Facebook very often actually to members of the communities. And this is essential. Essential is not conducting those meetings. Essential is building a relationship, friendships, a relation of trust with community members, and this requires a lot of time. And this is essential, and this is very important. These projects are running for 6 years or more and can actually pursue in this direction. Next slide. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. This is one thing that we can do in the project because we are active in Russia, in Canada, in the Nordic countries. So what we are trying to do is take advantage of this to look at some issues. And we asked that questions in 3 communities in Greenland, in Canada, and you will see on Svalbard, and we did one on Tixi, but I don't have the results here, and to see how did people see the impacts of permafrost. Next slide. And you will see that it's actually quite different. Most people in all of these communities, in Aklavik, in Canada, in Greenland, or in Nunavut, see permafrost as an issue, but you see that in Aklavik, it's a much more burning issue than it is in other communities. So this is very interesting because those communities are actually very different. There is no such thing as devising a plan for all communities in the Arctic. It just doesn't work. You need to have a very dedicated and targeted way to approach this issue. Next slide. And that's what we're doing. For instance, I'm going to show you an example now from Ilulissat. Next slide, Mia. And there, what we try to look at is the impacts of subsiding permafrost. And this picture is a complex picture, but what you need to take home is where you have some red on the picture is where the ground is subsiding. Here in Greenland, coastal erosion is not the main issue, for instance. It's very different. It's thawing in permafrost, threatening the existence of these buildings. Next slide. If you go to other communities, then you will have some other issues. This is Tuktoyaktuk in northern Canada. Next slide. And there, what we did is with high-resolution drones and photogrammetry is to try to map the extent of flooding in 2100, directly relating this extent very high resolution to each of the building, each of the houses in the community to map where the threats are. Next slide. But we're not only doing things at the local level, we're doing things at the global or circumarctic level. This is just a teaser actually for something we are building. We're working on an atlas on Arctic permafrost, which is being compiled by Grid Arendal in Norway. And they are making these fantastic maps. If you go see the Twitter account of Levi Westerveld from Grid Arendal, you see like he's popping up a lot of these great maps. And what we're trying to understand here is how many people live on permafrost, and what is the impact of thawing permafrost on the life of the people on the ground. And again, as I said, this is very different when you go from one community to the other. Next slide. And that will be it. As for all the other people, I will tell you, but I will tell you even stronger, please do go like our pages on Facebook. We would really appreciate it. And it's nice, you get a lot of news there and videos and snippets, and it's really cool. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Hugh. It's really impressive work and great that you're working with so many communities across the Arctic and studying all of these different interactions and interfaces. So terrific. Thank you. And our last but not least presentation will be coming from Professor Bruce Forbes of the Arctic Center, University of Lapland. And he is the project lead for Charter, the project I mentioned, a global effort to understand how climate and biodiversity changes will impact Arctic communities and their adaptive capacity.
Thanks, Mia. Thanks, Lindsay, and all the organizers for inviting Charter to present briefly here today. We are EU 7th Framework Project funded under the, Horizon 2020 project, and we're just past our 6-month milestone. So next slide, please. We began August 1st, and we had a virtual launch because of Corona in Rovaniemi in the first week of October. So we are a large consortium, 21 funded research institutions in 9 European countries, and in-kind participation from Russia and China, and 7 work packages and a budget of 5.9 million euros. And we have 3 main aims. First is to better understand past and ongoing responses of Arctic terrestrial social ecological systems to changes in biodiversity, snow and ice cover across decades and centuries. Second is to simulate future effects of social ecological changes for indigenous and local communities and traditional livelihoods out to the year 2050. And third, work directly with Arctic communities to co-develop strategies and policy pathways for livelihoods such as reindeer herding, hunting, and fishing. Next slide, please. So you see on the left a map of our consortium. The funded countries I mentioned were all in the EU, but you can see St. Petersburg and Yamal in there. You don't see Beijing Normal University on the map, but they're also providing supercomputing power. And the map on the right shows in white the very large area. That's a couple million square kilometers, where there's about 2 million head of semi-domesticated reindeer, which are privately, some collectively owned. And then in the green dots, those are study areas where we have existing data from. We're working mainly with existing data sets, and there will be some field work, not much, mainly new infrastructure in Finland and in Yamal, Russia. Next, please. And that shows the circumpolar scope of our project. So we have partners, for example, in Edinburgh, where we bring in data from the Canadian High Arctic and Qikqtarjuaq or Herschel Island in Canada. We have partnerships in Alaska and also extending to far eastern Siberia. Next slide, please. And these are our 7 work packages. I'm not going to give all the titles here, but they're working across multiple spatial scales from local to circumpolar and multiple time scales from the late Holocene, actually about the last 2,000 years out to the year 2050 I already mentioned. And you can see the on the bottom, the late Holocene. We chose that 2,000 year period because that's roughly where reindeer shifted from a wild hunting mode in Eurasian Arctic to the more semi-domesticated mode of reindeer management we see now. Next slide, please. And the overgrazing narrative in northern Fennoscandia in Russia, this is very similar, but I put a couple of media examples here from the last few years. Unfortunately, this overrides urgently needed discussion of biodiversity, climate change, and adaptation. So we see this in the media that reindeer herders are portrayed as overgrazing the tundra. What we don't see is, well, they're also eating the seedlings and shrubs that prevent the tundra from becoming a forest. So there are, you mentioned Mia earlier, ecosystem services. We don't use that rubric here, but it's clear that these types of livelihoods, painting them as a consumer of lichens and green biomass is a very simplistic worldview. And then on the left, you see the Russian anthrax outbreak of 2016, which also led quickly to a discussion of overgrazing. So we have co-developed this starting from the very first draft call when this came from Brussels 3 years ago. We started immediately discussing with our indigenous and local partners what this research should look like. Next slide, please. So we're partnering with other EU and US funded projects. I put one example here from the National Science Foundation where I'm a partner in with the Arctic Rain on Snow study. We have a team in Finland and in Russia. We have here and in Charter, we have early career and senior career indigenous scholars. And the issue there, rain on snow, there's also thaw refreeze events. These lead to catastrophic starvation you see on the bottom right of reindeer. And this is in Finland, when this happens on small scales, you see supplemental feeding of animals. In Russia, this is under discussion now. So we're really at the edge of a potential systemic change. And that's the last slide. I'd like to say thank you. And oh, there's always one more. This is the emphasis on participatory methods. As I already mentioned, we co-developed this from the very beginning, and we're synthesizing existing data sets. So that's what sets Charter apart really from a lot of projects of this size and scope. We're putting the emphasis on previously run projects that haven't looked at the data sets in this way, in an iterative process with our local and indigenous partners. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bruce. Terrific project. And I think your last points are really important to underscore the significance of co-production of knowledge and also of data, which you mentioned there, and trying to integrate existing data.
There's interviews with some of the, like Rosa Laptander, an Bennett scholar working the project. So if you go to our website there, you can see videos of the people working the project and from their perspective, what their role is. And it's a very well done portal. I had nothing to do with it. We just have a good web developer. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. And all this will be online for people to use these, go to these references later. So thanks again. And next, I'd like to turn things over to Henry Burgess, who is also an ASM3 Science Advisory Board member, as well as the head of the UK Natural Environment Research Council, NERC, hosted by the British Antarctic Survey. So Henry will be presenting key recommended actions to enhance Arctic understanding and prediction capability.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Mia, and thank you to all our panelists and speakers so far. It's always difficult to go last, but I will do my very best. And what I'd like to give you is a sense of where this work might take us, where the whole ASM process might take us, particularly for this theme, in terms of the recommended actions. Thank you. Next slide, please. the thing I really want to stress is that for me, theme 2, the understand theme, is a particularly critical section of ASM3, because it's about taking us from that observation stage, theme 1, to really understanding what the knowledge that we are observing, we are gathering, really means in the real world. And then it's about bridging to theme 3, the respond theme. And it's particularly the area, as we've seen in many of the presentations today, where non-Arctic states and others have so much to offer, both in leading the work, in leading the understand work, and in cooperating with others, but also in framing the global importance of understanding Arctic change. And I think, as we've seen, there have been great strides in both the ambition and the engagement in this area, and an increasing diversity of voices in terms of gender and Indigenous people, of experience and knowledge, and all that should be very much celebrated and encouraged. We are certainly not here or there yet, but now is absolutely the time to redouble our collective efforts. Next slide, please. So these are some of the things that I think will turn out to be the recommendations, the action points from the whole of the ASM3 process. Definitely, as we've seen in presentations already, truly understanding the environmental risks that the Arctic is facing. The role of humans as drivers of change, and the need to mitigate and adapt effectively. I think we're going to see recommendations around future global weather and climate patterns, in particular extreme weather events, the prediction of those extreme weather events, and the implications of those at a local, regional and global scale, and particularly understanding tipping points and cascading effects, both within global weather and climate patterns, but also more generally. We've seen already the focus on cross-cutting research to understand the detailed connections between environmental, social and economic systems, and I think we're going to see recommendations on those as part of the ASM3 process. What strikes me is the need to understand and generate predictions at pace. The Arctic is changing at record pace. The importance of predictions, accurate but rapid predictions, will be increasingly important to support effective decision making. And then respectful and empowering partnerships that fully include Indigenous researchers and that produce new knowledge. And importantly, where challenge is fair and welcome, challenge by Indigenous participants to traditional scientists, and then also fair and welcome challenge in the other direction, leading to new long-term research partnerships. And next slide, please. And I think we can group these potentially under 3 separate areas. So the first of these, building, and this is particularly encouraging the development of new large-scale ambitious international partnerships and initiatives with effective data analysis and synthesis. Big is very much not always better, but in many cases, in some cases, there are definitely opportunities for a continuation of the big projects, the big programs that are inclusive, that look at the big questions, and that help us understand change at scale, and particularly at interconnected scale. And then increasing, supporting research that shapes the prediction and mitigation of risks and hazards associated with Arctic change, particularly as they affect people that live in the Arctic and live in the near Arctic, and have those global connections. And we've seen some of those themes addressed so far in the presentations so far. And then prioritizing, so focusing attention on projects that look at connections between the various environmental components, and particularly those that enhance understanding of complex social, human and ecosystems. That's a very quick summary, and it's by no means comprehensive. The detail of the recommendations that will come out through the ASM process, I hope, will reflect some of that focus, but the detail of that is still to be agreed. And in truth, this webinar and all the other webinars are part of the process of shaping and finalizing those recommendations. So this is very much a continuing process. So thank you all for your input, and that will all be taken on board for these recommendations and for the process as a whole. Thanks, Mia, back to you.
Thanks so much, Henry. A terrific overview of understand and some of the key actions for turning those observations into actionable items that we can use to respond to all of these challenges in the Arctic. So we have a few minutes left for question and answers. If anyone, any of the attendees have questions, feel free to type them in the Q&A box.
Yeah, just a reminder to please use that Q&A box. That's the best way for the panelists to all see the questions. And while we're waiting, we just have a few minutes left. You can now register for the next webinar. So that's on the ASM3 website, and that will be addressing theme 3, understand. And if you have any lingering questions from this webinar, you can submit those to the ASM3 organizing committee. And we can also, get in touch with the panelists as well if you can't reach out to them directly.
And we have a question here from Anahit Hovsepian about whether the recording will be available on the website.
Yeah, the recordings will all be on the website and accessible through YouTube. We'll also share a PDF of the presentation, and as soon as we can, we'll also share a transcript. It's really our goal to make the information from this webinar series as accessible and public as possible. So you can also catch up on the previous webinars if you haven't seen them yet, all on the ASM3 website.
Let's see, I might pose a question to the panelists while we're waiting, since we still have a few more minutes. Let's see, since we've had examples from both Arctic and non-Arctic countries and researchers, what do you think are some exciting ways forward for how we can foster that type of international collaboration across the Arctic Circle? If any of the panelists want to jump in.
This is Bruce here. I could just comment that unfortunately with Corona, it looks like the next COP meeting in Scotland might have to be virtual as well, but I participated several years ago when the meeting was in Marrakesh, the COP meeting, and there was a session on Indigenous knowledge and climate change, and it was global, and I learned so much in there. So I think the participation of non-Arctic countries in fora like that, where, because it's rare when I go to a meeting like AGU or EGU, I'm in all these Arctic or polar sessions, but the exposure to the non-Arctic countries was really good. So even if meetings like COP end up being online for another year, I think they're worthwhile for these kinds of interactions like we had today.
Thanks, Bruce. I think that's a great point too, to think about how we can bring together Indigenous knowledge from worldwide as well, places as far afield as Morocco. I see a question here from Paul Arthur Berkman. Who are the recommendations going to for support?
Mia, shall I come in there?
Sure, please go ahead.
The process we're going through at the moment, and kind of Lindsay, Jenny, come in and correct me, but the process we're going through at the moment is of drafting the joint statement that will be signed up to by the Arctic Science Ministers. That's the kind of the end of this process. So that's gone through one version already. It's going through a second one now, and then there'll be a final version. So that's kind of going backwards and forwards in that happy kind of drafting phase. So the recommendations, and very much my words were, the words you saw from me were my words rather than the text that was in that joint statement. But that text is being agreed by all the science ministers with support from the with support from the Science Advisory Board as well. So that's an iterative process.
Great, thanks, Henry. And I think we have time for just this last question that's come into the Q&A. from an anonymous attendee who's asking whether the metadata for the submitted projects for ASM3 will become available for analysis, pointing out that it might be interesting to see which countries and which parts of the world are focusing on which part of Arctic science. Maybe Lindsay or Jenny, do you know about that?
Yeah, maybe Jenny and I can both answer that. I mean, so not just the joint statement is a result from this process, but also this science report that's really trying to summarize all of the science that we've gotten through all of the different feedback channels, you know, in one place, and then kind of the resulting actions that we find from all of that. What we're also working on, and Jenny, you can talk about this more too, is providing kind of a platform for accessing that data online. This hasn't been done for the previous ASM, so this would be kind of a new contribution through this ASM process. But we're looking at how to make all of that information more accessible so that cooperation opportunities can, you know, become more understood, and maybe organic connections can happen through this process.
Great, hopefully that answers that question.
Yep.
There aren't any more questions. I believe we are out of time today, so I'll turn it over to Lindsay to wrap things up.
Yeah, just thank you, so much to all of our panelists today. It's just wonderful to be able to have this sort of forum with representatives from around the world talking about Arctic science and really showing how globally relevant this topic is. So we thank all of our panelists very much, and we thank especially our Science Advisory Board members, Mia Bennett and Henry Burgess, for joining us and really helping us contextualize all of the projects and the science in the bigger picture today. So thank you all. Thank you to our attendees, and we'll see you at the next webinar on March 17th on Theme 3, Respond. All right, so thank you all and have a good morning, afternoon, and evening. See you.